Happy noon to everybody, and thanks for coming to our most recent presentation for the Aquinas Lecture Series. Today's presenter is Randy Wyatt, the director of the theater program here, and his title is When the Mask is You, Ethics in Coaching Actors Through Autobiographical Performance, as you can see right there. Help me welcome Randy Wyatt.
Dan. So here's how the story goes. About a year ago, there was a call for chapters for a new book that went out, that came down the pike. And this new book is to be called Safe Enough Spaces. And its content is to be about the ethics of actor coaching. And this is something that I've been waiting for a long time for my discipline to address. It's something that's underexplored and under-researched, and something that's been increasingly on my mind over the past decade or so, because I seem to keep running into strange encounters with ethics in actor coaching. And so I jumped at the chance to be able to contribute to this book. And my title for this chapter is what you see here. The subtitle has changed a little bit, Navigating Disclosure and Breakdown in Classroom Autobiographical Performance. And the book is soliciting chapters not just from theater professionals in the teaching side of things, but also in directors and therapists, where it coincides with psychotherapy and a whole bunch of social theater, theater for social justice people. All those folks are sort of contributing their 2 cents to try to comprise a rubric for how we handle ethics in actor coaching. And so I'm really excited about it. I hope you will be too by the time we're done. The bulk of my chapter is sort of analyzing a case study that happened, an incident that happened in one of my classes in Directing 2 a couple of cycles ago. And so we'll be talking about that. But first, let's kind of talk about when the mask is you. So we'll get into some actor theater nomenclature here. When I teach improvisation and I get to working with masks, there's this moment that I look for every time where I have a bunch of actors who are standing in front of the mirrors that we have in our space down in the black box in the PAC. And they aren't allowed to put the masks fully over their face until I tell them to. And I have them stare in the mirror, kind of look at themselves. And then I have them pull the masks down, and the masks are white, they're featureless, they're what we call neutral masks. And in that moment, they have a psychological spark where they look at themselves and they don't see their own face. They lose their identity for just a split second. Keith Johnstone, who's one of the movers and shakers in improv theory, calls it the trance of the mask, which gets it a little witch doctory. But the trance of the mask is what happens when an actor sees themselves with a brand new face, and they are released from all of the baggage of their face, the identity that they've constructed for themselves. And they're able to move in different ways. They're able to use their voice in different ways. I've seen mediocre actors suddenly come alive through mask work because they are completely someone else. They're different. And they're given that permission. They're giving themselves that permission by erasing that mask of the self. But there's still that idea that you're acting and that you're able to slip into this mask. You're able to take on this other persona. And it's not you, so whatever you do is fine. You're not responsible for it, right? It's some other person. And that's why actors will talk about, oh, that's what my character is doing, and that's why they wind up getting labeled as crazy, because they talk about characters as living, breathing people. But I've been becoming more and more interested in this idea of the mask of the self, because in the landscape of contemporary theater, there's an obsession with self. There's an obsession with reality. And you can even see, you're actually even participating in it if you are on Facebook. Facebook is just a massive interplanetary masquerade where a whole bunch of people are themselves online with each other, but it's not really themselves. It's this carefully constructed persona. And they even write scripts, and they interact with these selves back and forth, right? And that's a performative act. That's a whole bunch of people acting like themselves, or how they want other people to react to them. There's a great book called Reality Hunger. Some of my students know this. I've kind of pushed this on them in devising. By David Shields, which is a book-long manifesto about basically how we're entering into this time where reality is what we crave out of our entertainment. It's what we crave out of our theater. It's what we crave out of experience. We want it to be real. We want it to be almost hyper-real. And we're less interested in fictional constructs, and we're more interested in what's the real scoop. You know, what's the story behind the music, right? All of that, and obvious examples being reality shows and stuff like that, are the stories that we're really interested in. And we're seeing collisions between what we thought was real and what wasn't, like monologuist Mike Daisey, who would give a monologue, and it's theater, but it sounds like it's really his own experience. And so when we find out on NPR that it's not actually was his experience, the whole country, or at least NPR, or Ira Glass, is angry at him for misrepresentation. But isn't he a theater artist? Isn't he putting together, isn't he constructing a performance for you? And so those lines have blurred. And there's that novelist or memoirist, depending on how you come down on it, for a million little pieces that Oprah took to task, right? Because it turned out it wasn't true, this amazing story. But we bought the book, and we were really hungry for that reality. And so those lines between fiction and reality are blurring daily, and it's having an effect in performance studies as well. The idea of pulling from your own story, from your own narrative, from your own life, has been a topic in a variety of performance classes forever. Acting, of course, you pull from your own natural impulses to be able to create a character, right? Or we'll talk later about the idea of emotional memory, which has always been a controversial method of acting, where if you have to feel sad, you reach into your brain and you think about a time that you were sad, and you sort of transpose that experience onto the stage, right? Improvisation, we say, first thing comes to your mind, go, right? You accept that whatever that spontaneous impulse is, and you go with it. Playwriting, write what you know, right? That caveat we always tell writers, write what you know. So you're pulling from your own experience. And directing a performance class is also more personal than you may think. And we'll get to that in a minute. Oh, I keep forgetting I don't have to come up here. I got the magic device. Cool. So the book that the chapter is from is called Safe Enough Spaces. And it's sort of a play on the idea, on a buzz phrase in theater pedagogy of this is a safe space. You can play here, you can explore here, you can take risks here. That's the sort of nomenclature we use when we're teaching an acting class, of allowing students the room to be able to break down their own inhibitions and break down the same old things and try new things in class, which can be scary and risky. So we say, this is a safe place. It's a space to fail, whatever that means for that student. Even though we say there's no real definition of failure here, the student often creates the definition of failure. And if they fail according to that definition, you can have a lot of sort of psychological noise about that. It's a space to explore new identities, situations, impulses, all that sort of thing. But are our spaces safe enough? And that's sort of the question of the book. What happens in those times when we say this is a safe place and it's time for you to try new things? It's time for you to take risks in front of other people. It's time for you to try to move in different ways, interact in different ways, put a sword in your hand and have somebody else have a sword in their hand and play that way, right? So we want to keep them physically safe. We want to keep them pedagogically safe as far as what we ask them to do as teachers. We want to keep them emotionally safe and psychologically safe, and those last two are the ones I'm sort of going to be talking about here today. Because plays run the gamut, that's the point. There's so many different types of experiences, so many different types of characters, and we ask our students to delve into those situations, into those materials, and come up with truthful choices, which demands something of them. It demands honesty from them, and it demands trust. Trust that they're not going to get laughed off the stage. Trust that they're going to be able to try new things, and if they don't work, they can be honest about them not working. In other art forms, you've got the canvas, right? You're doing the work on the canvas, and that's separate from you. And so if the canvas is getting critiqued, well, you can get your feelings hurt, certainly, but it's separate from you. But in acting, it's you. It's actually you. When you are auditioning, you are being rejected. Now, actors with training realize that it's actually their skills. Sometimes it has nothing to do with their skills. Sometimes they're just not right for the part, and that's fine. That's the way the biz works, and you move on. But students aren't necessarily like that. Students very often will internalize that rejection. And so when we're in a classroom, sometimes the dividing line between keeping them safe and pushing them, challenging them, can get blurred. So I'm a little ahead of myself, but why wouldn't they be safe? Here are three reasons why there's a risk, there's a danger factor here. And I already mentioned it, but the idea of emotional memory is really, really still one of the major ways we teach acting. The idea of if you have to be sad on stage, if you're Electra, and you have to cry for, 2 hours, or 3 hours, or 4, you will reach in to your mind and remember that one time when your puppy died and you were really sad. And then you will bring that through and put it on stage so that you can be Electra mourning her brother or whoever, right? And you're able to access those emotions on stage. The controversial thing about emotional memory is that psychologically healthy? Is that a good idea? To constantly relive these traumatic experiences that, yes, you're channeling in a different way, but you still have to access over and over again for the consumption of other people. Now, you can, bring up Honey Boo Boo and all that sort of thing, and we're kind of in a culture that thrives off of the suffering of other people, right? But I'd like to think that my classroom is a little more high class than that. So that is a question, and the trick here is that we, as theater teachers, are very often encouraging our students to be vulnerable. And what is vulnerability on stage? It's sort of this nebulous quality. But we know when we see it, good actors have vulnerability. They are able to access truthful emotions, what seems like effortlessly, in whenever it's demanded of them. And so we want our student actors to compete with that level of vulnerability. How do you achieve that in the classroom? And then there's this director-actor dynamic that I think gets compounded in the collegiate atmosphere. So directing as an art is not that old compared to the other arts in theater. Directing has only been around since about the 1700s, where you have the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen and you have Wagner and those guys who are finally saying, okay, I'm just going to step out here and move everything together, and you do this, and you do this, and you shut up, and and everything, you coordinate everything. That wasn't happening in Shakespeare's time. That wasn't happening in Greek theater. There wasn't somebody directing anything. In Shakespeare's time, it was a group affair. The playwright was involved, and the playwright sort of had some director powers, but the players had just as many. So since the 1700s, we've imbued this one person with the ability to coordinate and see the whole production and to reflect back to the actors some perspective of what they're doing and how everything looks. And as we've gone on, the director has taken on this there's become this code, almost unspoken code, that you do what the director says. End of story. Director says, do this, you do it. Now, that's changing somewhat as the different dynamics get debated, and actors will step up and certainly have plenty to say about their own performance. But in general, as a whole, that's still kind of the way it works. The director says, here's how it happens, and the actors do it. And students will, since many of them are coming right out of being with their parents in the home structure, and because when you're talking specifically about me, I'm also their professor as well as a director, that dynamic gets even more compounded. And so there's this whole idea of, well, I'm going to do what you say and not even think about it because you're the director. That's why. And that can lead to some ethical blurring, as you can imagine. And my last thing here is psychodramatic boundaries. And to talk about this, I kind of have to talk a little bit about psychodrama, which is where my discipline and clinical psychology sort of overlap. Psychodrama, what is it? It's a theater-based type of psychotherapy. It's usually in group therapy. And it seeks to allow the patient to gain control over his or her own narrative, her own life. If they've got some issue, some event in their life that they can't seem to get over, you can actually recreate through theatrical impulses and structures, recreate that moment in therapy so that they get some handle on it, so they could perhaps say the thing they always needed to say to that person who's passed away, or get some control over a traumatic event, right? It's very powerful. It's very powerful. I've seen it in action. I've taken several classes in it. I've taken enough classes in it to know that it's completely something a clinical psychologist should be doing and not a theater teacher, right? But there are, again, blurred boundaries here. Also, just for definition's sake, there's also sociodrama, which is sort of a little sister of psychodrama, and sociodrama aims to study group dynamics, and sociodrama doesn't tend to be so heavy-duty as psychodrama. There's more overlap. It's more fun games. For instance, I have used psychodrama in classes and seminars. I had a group of homeless folk who came to a seminar in the Hartside area, and we did a construct called vehicles, where I have each one get up on stage, and they have boxes, they have cubes, they have other stuff, and they create their own vehicle of their life. And they talk about what it's like to pilot that vehicle. And so it's very heavy reliant on metaphor. And so some people were on rafts and talking about being kind of going along wherever the river took them, right? And some would be in old trucks with flat tires and feel like they were stuck. And it was a way for them to be able to talk about their lives in a metaphorical way that was really powerful to watch happen, for them to be able to take some ownership of the art that they were doing and be able to merge that with their life. So quick and dirty, so that you understand where I'm going with my case study here, here's some elements of psychodramatic technique. In a psychodramatic context, you have the director, who is the therapist, and the director will usually play a sociodrama game with the group to see who's ready to be worked with. And usually that game, someone in the group will start talking about something very personal to them, and they will warm up. And that's the terminology in psychodrama. when a protagonist starts to warm up, the protagonist being the patient, they start getting more and more emotionally invested in what they're talking about, and they lose what we call aesthetic distance, the distance between the performer and the art. They start relating more and more to what they're talking about, right? And so the director will call the protagonist up on stage, and there are a variety of different structures that the director can start that the protagonist will act in. For instance, it may be as simple as one of the structures is called a family portrait, where the director calls up the protagonist, and the protagonist perhaps has grief issues with their grandmother, let's say. And so they will have the protagonist choose other people in the group therapy to come up on stage and be the other people in this family portrait. They will actually pose them on stage. They might even give them a few lines so that the people that they call up know how to act like their family members. Those people that they're calling up to be on stage are called auxiliaries. So there are these other people to help them in their psychodrama. Auxiliaries can be all kinds of things. They could be the devil speaking the things they really can't say, right, in back of the protagonist, right? They can be, I've seen very heavy-duty scenes set up where the protagonist was a victim of date rape. And they actually, with the director's guidance, creates that scenario again, but the protagonist is able to now get out of it. And they feel like at least they've played through a scenario where they got some power back. And then they actually ended this psychodrama by placing the auxiliary who is playing the rapist in hell and created hell on stage and placed him right there in the middle of it. Is this something that I would do in a classroom? Oh no, absolutely not. Do I want this to happen in a classroom? Oh no, no I do not. Because I don't want my students to be going through breakdowns in class. I want them to be going through breakthroughs. But a breakthrough and a breakdown has a very thin line between them. A very thin line. It's more complicated when we're talking about autobiographical performance, because there is that mask that they create for themselves, and we're asking them to be even more vulnerable and even more transparent. It also has some dangers in the fact that when you're in the middle of performing and you've got the adrenaline of performing, you might accidentally disclose stuff you weren't expecting to disclose if your main material was stuff you're pulling from your own life. Strangely, it can also lead the performer to make less truthful choices in an attempt to shield themselves, an attempt to protect themselves. So they may create this other, right, that isn't really them, and think that they're being truthful about those acting choices when in fact it's kind of fake, it's kind of telegraphed, because that's the psychology of what's going on there, right? They're protecting themselves from over-disclosure. And so, how do we as educators lead performance students to breakthroughs while avoiding breakdowns? That's sort of what I'm really interested in and what I'm looking to explore in this chapter, mostly through what happened with Maxine. So here's the scenario. Maxine, not her real name, was a 20-year-old theater student who had seen herself mostly as an actress while she was a performer, while she was here. And like all theater students, she had to take Directing 1, which was new to her. And she found that she really liked it. And I thought that she had talent. I thought it was opening up new venues for her to express herself. And Directing 1 is a requirement for all theater students, but Directing 2 is an elective. And she decided to take Directing 2 at my urging. I think that Maxine thought directing was a perfect way to go because she was in a place in her development as an actress where she kept butting up against me and other adjunct professors here saying, you're just not vulnerable. You don't have that sense of vulnerability. Sometimes when you're on stage and you're trying to access true emotions, you come off wooden. You come off manufactured. She was frustrated by that because she just kept coming up against that. And she was scared of it. And some of what I'll be saying to you today is informed by interviews I had with her after the fact. So I was able to really get inside of her head and find out how she felt at the time during this whole thing. But she admitted that the vulnerability thing was frustrating, but it was also frightening because there were things in her life that she was afraid would spill out on stage, depending on what she was doing. So she gravitated towards comedy more than drama. And at the same time, she was frustrated with herself. She wanted to be a good actress. She wanted to conquer herself when it came to drama. But directing, too, seemed great because directors are puppet masters, right? Like, they don't actually have to be on stage. They just make everybody else feel things, right? And so there was this degree of distance that appealed to her about taking this class and about going forward as becoming a good director. And so, of course, I have to frustrate that by immediately, the first project in the class is an autorama. Now, an autorama project is something that I did when I was in graduate school. I really liked it. I took to it and decided it would be a good fit for directing 2 class. An autorama is a 10-minute, one-person show that's based on the highlights of that person's life. You're telling your own life story, the highlights. And you are able to use any type of modality you want to perform that. You can use puppets. You can use other people as long as you're the only one talking. You can use lots of lights and costumes and set, or you can strip it all down and make it very, very bare. You've got total creative freedom about how you want to make this happen. And this project originally comes from a great director and teacher, Mel Shapiro, in his book, The Director's Companion, which is a text that I use for directing too. And so I say, and the first time, I should say, during the time that Maxine was doing this the first time, I said, anything that you want as far as details for this project, refer to the book, right? Kind of like here it is, but, for further understanding, read Mel, because he's great, right? And Mel emphasizes it needs to be theatrical, but it also needs to be personal. And this is what he says about the personal part, right? It must be personal. Get to scenes, moments, events in your life that have been important and meaningful. If there are areas that are very painful for you, don't go near them. This isn't psychodrama. If, however, an area is emotionally difficult, but also you want to try, explore it. Thanks, Mel. Because what he does here is he's writing that line that I'm talking about between vulnerability and breakdown. He's saying, well, so I don't get sued. Don't go nuts. This isn't therapy. This isn't psychodrama. However, it would be really cool if you really explored the deep, dark nature of stuff you've never put on stage before and never dreamed of saying in front of other people, right? That isn't what he's saying, but that may be what the student is reading. And so Maxine immediately had a lot of anxiety about this project, and she immediately hid that anxiety from me. I had tried to make it, I wasn't completely oblivious to these dangers. I had said, I did this is how I did this. You find a metaphor that fits what you want to say, and hit the highlights, and I talked about aesthetic distance, that you didn't want to lose aesthetic distance. But in retrospect, I feel like those instructions weren't enough. That what they were really saying was kind of what Mel was saying, which was, okay, well, here's some guidelines, but if you're really cool and you really are taking this seriously, you're going to throw down. You're going to make this happen. And so Maxine put together her autorama, and requested to go last, which did kind of make me go, that's interesting, because she's not usually one to do that. And before I get into that, I do want to say, while there are some theater students who would love the chance to break down on stage, love it, Maxine is not one of those students. She's not histrionic. She wasn't looking to have some frothy emotional moment on stage. She wanted to be in control of her performance. So all the other students had gone, and she was the last one to go. And she set up her stage, and her stage was a small table and a whole bunch of other items which I couldn't immediately recognize, and a glass vase, the kind of vase that you would get at Hobby Lobby or something like that. Kind of big, right? And clear, transparent. And she started her autorama talking about herself, and she pulled out a Barbie doll. And she started talking about a series of very painful events. She stripped the Barbie doll, and she put the Barbie doll into the vase. And then she started pouring different substances into the vase as she talked about different things that had happened to her that had to do with substance abuse, parental abuse, date rape, a whole bunch of different things. And she would fill it with pills, she filled it with alcohol, and it filled up with all of these objects so that the Barbie doll was completely immersed in it. And then she started losing aesthetic distance on stage, and she picked up the whole thing and smashed it on the floor. And that was the end of her autorama. And I thought, perhaps, my teaching career. Because at that moment, it was the worst nightmare that I had thought of in association with this project, right? Like the worst thing that could possibly happen. And so I was a little dazed, I think it's safe to say, and I took a break because I think everybody needed a break. I was like, 10 minutes, let's come back and look at this. And before I talk about how I handled that and where we went from there, so what happened, right? What are the dynamics that led to this? In my interview with Maxine, she said that what she had gotten from the things I had said in class was, and not just this class, but just in general, was that if I fail at theater, I fail at life. And that is the amount of investment theater students have in what they're doing. I've talked to colleagues in other disciplines, and they talk about how they wish that their students had the drive and the investment in their discipline that theater students have. Because theater students will stay in the PAC until 3 in the morning to finish something, and they will get up at ungodly hours if they have to make a production meeting, and they will go the extra mile because they are that invested in the discipline. And it will come down to this phrase, if I fail at theater, I fail at life, and if I have to do this project in order to become a better director, I don't have a choice. I have to do this project. And then there are all these perceptions that I think are influenced by that whole director-actor dynamic that I was talking about. I'm the director, I'm the professor, I'm the program chair. I'm everything, right? And so if she lets me down, her perception is she's let me down in every context, not just this one, right? That's a lot. That's a lot for a theater student to have to wrestle with. We also had some miscommunications in talking about the idea of specificity. That's another buzz term that we use. We're talking about being specific about what choices actors make, right? And so she felt that she would be, it would not be honest of her as a performer to not lay bare every single detail of her life. There were huge moments in her life, and obviously very dramatic in her life. And the only way she could really see for that to be on stage is to, boom, put it on stage, exactly in those terms, to let everybody know exactly what was going on throughout the whole process. And so that was her trying to get over her feeling of her problems with vulnerability. Well, I can't say she's not vulnerable during that performance anymore. She was the epitome of that. Also, I can't help but feel like all of the elements of psychodrama except the therapist were present here, right? We actually had group therapy without a therapist. And And on top of it all, it gets graded. And she's an A student. So she cares about that too, of course. So we kind of have this perfect storm of all these different dynamics, these pressures that she was feeling in order to accomplish what I felt were important goals that the project served. Vulnerability, learning how to tell a story, learning how to direct, right? And so we came back, and I had arranged the room into a circle, and thereby obliterated the stage. Stage was gone. And so I was kind of taking a little tip of the hat from therapy here of and now we're all equals, right? We're all going to sit down, and we're going to talk about how this made us feel, instead of talking about your choices and what I felt were effective or ineffective and why you're not a good director and that kind of a thing, right? That would be inappropriate. So we all sat down and talked it through, and we talked about it in terms of how we felt. And it felt, and I checked in with her afterwards, and she felt like that was a good way to handle how she was feeling at the time. And then I strongly encouraged her to go to career and counseling at that point, which she reluctantly did. But in retrospect, says that she was very happy that she did, because she was ready for a breakdown like this. If that makes sense. She had all of these things going on in her head, and she wound up, it was going to come out in one theatrical context or another, I'm pretty sure. I just happened to have really made it very, very convenient for her to do that there. And then, so life's funny, and Maxine wasn't able to finish the course for health reasons. And the course comes around every other year. So, and she really wanted to take the course again. She felt like she didn't get to complete the work that she wanted to do in the course. And I had said to her, after what happened, I'm still struggling about whether or not to keep this Autorama here. But let's talk about it, and let's see how we can retool it to actually meet some of the learning objectives here, and kind of see if we can move around, because she was not going to be the only person to have this reaction. And I was convinced that the project, while it's not worth somebody's psychological health, has a lot of good in it, as far as some of the things I've already mentioned. So I was able to have this rare chance to offer Maxine a do-over and to be able to do the Autorama again, but to do it a little bit reworked. And I think in retooling the Autorama here, we're able to talk a little bit about some of the ethical guidelines that I would put forward. That would be a rubric for autobiographical performance in the classroom. That there has to be an atmosphere of trust, that there has to be an emphasis on the choice of metaphor and modality, and there has to be what I'm calling protagonism. And so let me go through that here. So let's analyze this first project. Maxine was in a atmosphere of what I would call forced trust, right? Like, trust us, not that you have a choice, because you're getting a grade, right? So there has to be, there's this weird, tension between, well, I have to grade you for this project, but this project has plenty of non-objective parts to it, very subjective. So, but that's the way theater is all the way around. So it had this forced trust, and she wasn't communicating with me. She wasn't coming to talk to me about her anxieties. And so they got to a fever pitch by the time that we hit that class. Interestingly, I think Barbie served as a psychodramatic auxiliary. She had this moment, she told me later, during the performance, where she looked at that stripped-down Barbie in that glass filled with all those substances and said, "How pathetic, that's me." And she had this sense of revulsion, not sympathy, revulsion for what she saw. And she identified, and she had a flash of identification during the performance. So, At that moment, she was performer, director, playwright, critic, therapist, and audience member all at once. And that's enough for, that's dissertation worthy right there. Like there's a lot of dynamics going on in that flash of performance right there on stage. I think it's also interesting to note that Maxine had tried to go to therapy before this class. She had tried to address some of her personal issues before, but it had failed for her because she didn't know what to say in therapy. It was very rhetorical. Performance actually allowed her to find the metaphor to be able to talk about this. And I thought that was significant. Another interesting thing about her project, there was no dramatic action. She herself wasn't acting out the project. She was using Barbie as sort of a puppet, right? An auxiliary of herself. And Barbie was trapped. And things just happened to Barbie. Barbie doesn't do anything. She's a pure victim throughout her whole performance, aka life. And I emphasize dramatic action in pretty much every single class I teach. Dramatic action is the absolute basic component of acting, of directing, of script analysis, of improvisation, of playwriting, all of those things. It's really important that an action causes something else to happen. The actors act. They don't sit back and have an atmosphere. They actually do things, right? So, let's talk about her second project. When she, with plenty of talking between her and I, she decided on, and this was also 2 years later, plenty of significant therapy later, she chose the metaphor of a path that was created by stones. And along the path that she would walk along the stage were little stations that had candles. And she would come to a station and talk about an important part of her life, and sometimes she would blow that candle out. Sometimes she would come up to a candle and it would get snuffed out. Sometimes she would come to a candle and it wasn't lit, and she'd relight it. Sometimes she found herself walking backwards on that path and relighting something she didn't think she was going to be able to relight. This metaphor did not get into lurid details of many of those experiences, but it spoke volumes about how she felt about those experiences. And it was a performance that we were able to enter into because we could find similar moments in our lives where that made sense. The emphasis had shifted from all of these terrible details of her life to a bigger picture, metaphor, that is something that was artistic, that had aesthetic value, and that we could share, and became a performance. So in Project 2, I placed a heavier emphasis on the fact that what happens in this room stays in this room. This is a safe space. And you don't talk about what you see in this room outside of the room. And I had my doubts about how theater students were going to handle that, and they've handled that beautifully, far better than I thought. They've been very, very good about that sort of thing. At the same time, I've emphasized the idea that you don't have to spill your guts. You just have to tell a story, and it needs to be compelling. And therefore, you need to choose the right metaphor that speaks the truth that you're trying to get out there. And so you encode that metaphor, and you endlessly unpack that metaphor, because the metaphor of a path for Maxine had lights that she was in control of. Those were dramatic actions she was taking. She walks the path, she lights the candles or gets rid of the candles, right? And she was able to talk about certain events with more depth because she had a certain aesthetic distance from them, and others that she still didn't really feel like she had an aesthetic distance from, she was able to still allude to and tell the story of without giving us all these dirty details without it turning into therapy. And so I've kind of got into my last point here of acting like a protagonist. Instead of that whole puppet master idea that I think the Barbie project had, that whole trying to put some distance between herself and this auxiliary of her, she stepped up and was the protagonist and was the actress telling her story, but through a carefully selected physical vocabulary, through a carefully selected visual vocabulary, a theatrical vocabulary that could give the same depth and the same theatrical impact to the audience without it turning harmful psychologically. Let's see. Yeah, so what do we take away from the Autorama incident and this whole idea of the mask of the self? It's all about choices and emphases, which is sort of going back to basics. Acting is all about choices, and directing is all about what you emphasize and de-emphasize in order to tell a story. But again, it's about the cleverness, the well-chosen metaphor that brings that all to life. Without trust, there could be no profitable risks. I could have just not done this exercise. I could have been like, holy cow, that's my worst nightmare, goodbye, right? But I felt like one of the tricky things about theater pedagogy is that you do that, and then you have actors who cannot be vulnerable and aren't able to access emotions. And so you have to be able to establish a atmosphere of trust, real trust, and triply emphasize the fact that you are available to talk about projects before they happen. I think there's also a sort of an idea of like, it's theatrical to be like, and here's my projects, right? Not wanting to talk to the professor about it, but be like, and now here it is. And sometimes that can be problematic. I think it was here. And dramatic action is king, always coming back to dramatic action, making sure that that person is not creating an auxiliary. I think that was part of the problem, was that all of these things could happen to Barbie, and it was allowing her to say all these things. Therapeutic, great. Performance, not so great. And when breakthroughs lead to breakdowns, that is counselor territory. And I'm thankful that I had enough training in psychodrama to be able to recognize that and to be able to say, okay, you are now no longer in my classroom. Like, my classroom can't help you here at this point. Now you need to go over here, right? Because I am not trained in that. And I feel like just that much is something that needs to be trained in our discipline, that theater professors need to know when breakthroughs have led to breakdowns, and what to do in their local collegiate context when that happens. I think that brings me to my last slide. Are there any questions? What did you just say? What?
You talk about confidentiality and
Yeah.
what is in the classroom stays in the classroom. And I was a couple minutes late coming in, so I don't know if you addressed this already, Randy. But how do you grapple with the idea of sharing her case study in this context, where obviously we're all hearing her story and
I will. I'll forgo the jokes I was just thinking. I talked for a long time about Maxine, to Maxine, and said, how are you feeling about this? And she said, looking back on it now, because she's a couple years out, it was one of the most important moments in my collegiate career, and I'm fine with it now. So I felt like she had enough distance, and I talked with her further to kind of really feel that out, but I feel like she really had enough distance to be able to say, yeah, okay, this was the journey that I took, and being able to do the Autorama again was a tremendous source of validation, of feeling like she had conquered what she was still typifying as her own failure the first time around. I think she felt like she failed at the Autorama, which I don't think it would matter how much I said otherwise. She has her own standard. And so for her to be able to do it again, she got power over it. And then she was like, and then when we talked about the idea of, doing this project and how it could stir up these issues for other people, she was very happy to allow me to talk about what happened to her in this context. So, but yeah, there's certainly a paradoxical, like, I'm going to tell you all about this thing, and nobody should talk about these things. but yeah, I do think that theater teachers are going to recognize moments like these, because moments like these do happen, not all the time, but they happen in acting and directing and in different types of, and I'm sure that they happen in communication context too, in public speaking, and more and more and more, there's this idea that we should be pulling from our students' lives to be able to create projects. Writing happens too, right? And I don't think that we have to be crazy walking on eggshells about that, because I like to treat my students as adults, but there's an idea, especially because of these dynamics in theater, where you want to do what the director says and you want to be awesome and you want to throw down, that there are these extra pressures that they're just not thinking of that normally they would think of, I think. Sure. Anything else? Thank you. It's real fun to be able to share this stuff with you today.